My old office in Gaza is a pile of rubble. The streets around it where I went for coffee, ordered maftool or manakish, had a haircut, are flattened. Friends and colleagues are dead, or more often vanished. Last heard from weeks or months ago, no doubt buried somewhere under the broken slabs of concrete. The uncounted dead in the tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Gaza is a wasteland of 50 million tons of rubble and debris. Rats and dogs scavenge amid the ruins and fetid pools of raw sewage. The putrid stench and contamination of decaying corpses rises from beneath the mountains of shattered concrete. Palestinians risk death from unexploded ordnance left behind after some 20 months of airstrikes, artillery barrages, missile strikes, and blasts from tank shells, as well as a variety of toxic substances, including pools of raw sewage and asbestos. Israel, supplied with billions of dollars of weapons from the United States, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, created this hell. It intends to maintain it. Hepatitis A, caused by drinking contaminated water, is rampant, as are respiratory ailments, scabies, malnutrition, and the widespread nausea and vomiting caused by eating rancid food. Nearly 500,000 people are facing starvation. Some 1.9 million people have been displaced, amounting to 90% of the population. They live in makeshift tents, encamped amid slabs of concrete or in the open air. Many have been forced to move over a dozen times. 9 in 10 homes have been destroyed or damaged. Apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, bakeries, mosques, universities. Israel blew up Isra University in Gaza City and the Turkish Palestinian hospital on March 21st in controlled demolitions, along with cemeteries, shops, and offices have been obliterated. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, estimates that clearing Gaza of the rubble will take 15 years and cost between $40 billion and $50 billion. But any rebuilding of Gaza, Israel and the Trump administration have decided will not be done for the Palestinians. Israeli organizations, including the far-right Nakala organization, have held conferences to prepare for Jewish colonization of Gaza once Palestinians are removed. This is the last chapter of the genocide. It is the final blood-soaked push to drive the Palestinians from Gaza. No food, no medicine, no shelter, no clean water, no electricity. Israel has turned Gaza into Dante-esque cauldron of human misery, where Palestinians, at least 54,000 dead and 123,000 wounded, are being slaughtered in their hundreds and soon again in their thousands and tens of thousands, or they will be forced out, never to return. The final chapter marks the end of Israeli lies. The lie of the two-state solution. The lie that Israel respects the laws of war that protect civilians. The lie that Israel bombs hospitals and schools only because they are used as staging areas by Hamas. The lie that Hamas uses civilians as human shields, while Israel routinely forces captive Palestinians to enter potentially booby-trapped tunnels and buildings ahead of Israeli troops. The lie that Hamas or Palestine Islamic Jihad are responsible, the charge often being errant Palestinian rockets, for the destruction of hospitals, United Nations buildings, or mass Palestinian casualties. The lie that humanitarian aid to Gaza is blocked because Hamas is hijacking the trucks or smuggling in weapons and war material. The lie that Israeli babies are beheaded or Palestinians carried out mass rape of Israeli women. The lie that 75% of the tens of thousands killed in Gaza were Hamas terrorists. The lie that Hamas, because it was allegedly rearming and recruiting new fighters, is responsible for the breakdown of the ceasefire agreement. Israel's naked genocidal visage is exposed. It is driving Palestinians, many facing starvation, from northern Gaza, luring them south to the border with Egypt by setting up a few paltry food stations, none designed to feed 2.3 million desperate Palestinians, but corral them into caged military zones, engineered concentration camps. Israel shot dead at least 20 people trying to get aid from the newly formed Israeli and U.S.-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And this is a familiar counterinsurgency tactic, one the U.S. used in Vietnam, as well as the war in El Salvador, which I covered. It is about luring people like mice into a trap and positioning them along the Egyptian border to expel them. What comes next is mass starvation, scores of daily dead from diseases caused by contaminated water and food, and bombs, missiles, shells, and bullets. Nothing will function. Bakeries, water treatment and sewage plants, hospitals, schools, aid distribution centers, or clinics. Less than half of the 53 emergency vehicles operated by the Palestine Red Crescent Society are functional due to fuel shortages, and soon there will be none. Israel's message is unequivocal. Gaza will be uninhabitable. Leave or die. Since March 18th, when Israel broke the ceasefire with heavy bombing, over 3,700 children under the age of 18 have been wounded and 1,300 killed, bringing the total during 20 months of genocide to 17,000 children dead and 34,000 wounded. That's around 1 in every 20 children in Gaza. In one 24-hour period, 400 Palestinians were killed. But this is only the start. The images from Gaza during the 20 months of incessant attacks were awful, but what is coming now will be worse. It will rival the most atrocious war crimes of the 20th century, including the mass starvation, wholesale slaughter, and leveling of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943 by the Nazis. October 7th marked the dividing line between an Israeli policy that advocated the brutalization and subjugation of the Palestinians and a policy that calls for their annihilation and removal from historic Palestine. What we are witnessing is the equivalent of the moment triggered by the killing of some 200 soldiers led by George Armstrong Custer in June 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. After that humiliating defeat, Native Americans were slated to be exterminated, with the remnants forced into prisoner of war camps, later named reservations, where tens of thousands died of disease, lived under the merciless gaze of their armed occupiers, and fell into a life of immiseration and despair. Expect the same for the Palestinians in Gaza, dumped, I suspect, in one of the world's hellholes and forgotten. The expansion of Greater Israel, which includes the seizing of Syrian territory in the Golan Heights, southern Lebanon, Gaza, and the occupied Bank, where some 40,000 Palestinians have been driven from their homes and which I expect will soon be annexed by Israel, is being cemented into place. But the genocide in Gaza is only the start. The world is breaking down under the onslaught of the climate crisis, which is triggering mass migrations, failed states, and catastrophic wildfires, hurricanes, storms, flooding, and droughts. As local stability unravels, industrial violence, which is decimating the Palestinians, will become ubiquitous. Israel's annihilation of Gaza marks the end of a global order, guided by internationally agreed upon laws and rules, ones often violated by the United States in its imperial wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but ones that were at least acknowledged as a utopian vision. The U.S. and its Western allies not only supplied the weaponry to sustain the genocide, but it struck the demand by most nations for an adherence to humanitarian law. They have carried out attacks against the only nation, Yemen, which has tried to halt the genocide. The message this sends is clear. We have everything. If you try and take it away from us, we will kill you. The militarized drones, helicopter gunships, walls and barriers, checkpoints, coils of concertina wire, watchtowers, detention centers, deportations, brutality and torture, denial of entry visas, apartheid existence that comes with being undocumented, loss of individual rights and electronic surveillance are as familiar to the desperate migrants along the Mexican border or attempting to enter Europe as they are to the Palestinians. Israel, which, as Ronan Bergman notes in his book Rise and Kill, has assassinated more people than any other country in the Western world, cynically employs the Nazi Holocaust to justify its hereditary victimhood and justify its settler colonial state, apartheid, campaigns of mass slaughter, and Zionist version of Lebensraum. Primo Levi, who survived Auschwitz, saw the Shoah for this reason as, quote, an inexhaustible source of evil, which is perpetuated as hatred in the survivors and springs up in 1,000 ways against the very will of all, a thirst for revenge, as moral breakdown, as negation, as weariness, as resignation. Genocide and mass extermination are not the exclusive domain of fascist Germany. Adolf Hitler, as Ami Césaire writes in Discourse on Colonialism, appeared exceptionally cruel only because he presided over the humiliation of the white man. But the Nazis, he writes, had simply applied colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. The German slaughter of the Herero and Namakwa, the Armenian genocide, the Bengal famine of 1943, then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill airily dismissed the deaths of 3 million Hindus in the famine by calling them, quote, a beastly people with a beastly religion, along with the dropping of nuclear bombs on the civilian targets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, illustrates something fundamental about Western civilization. The moral philosophers who make up the Western canon, Immanuel Kant, Voltaire, David Hume, John Stuart Mill, and John Locke, as Nicole Fleetwood points out, excluded, enslaved, and exploited people, indigenous peoples, colonized people, women of all races, and the criminalized from their moral calculus. In their eyes, European whiteness alone imparted modernity, moral virtue, judgment, and freedom. This racist definition of personhood played a central role in justifying colonialism, slavery, the genocide of Native Americans, our imperial projects, and our fetish for white supremacy. So when you hear that the Western canon is an imperative, ask yourself for who? In America, the poet Langston Hughes said, Negroes do not have to be told what fascism is in action. We know. Its theories of Nordic supremacy and economic suppression have long been realities to us. The Nazis, when they formulated the Nuremberg laws, modeled them on our Jim Crow-era segregation and discrimination laws. Our refusal to grant citizenship to Native Americans and Filipinos, although they lived in the U.S. and U.S. territories, was copied by the German fascists to strip citizenship from Jews. Our anti-miscegenation laws, which criminalized interracial marriage, was the impetus to outlaw marriages between German Jews and Aryans. American jurisprudence classified anyone with 1% of black ancestry, the so-called one-drop rule, as black. The Nazis, ironically, showing more flexibility, classified anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents as Jewish. And fascism was quite popular in the United States in the 1920s and the 1930s. The Ku Klux Klan, mirroring the fascist movement sweeping through Europe, experienced a huge revival in the 1920s. Nazis were embraced by American eugenicists who lauded the Nazi goal of racial purity and disseminated Nazi propaganda. Charles Lindbergh, who accepted a swastika medal from the Nazi Party in 1938, along with the evangelist Gerald Winrod's pro-Hitler defenders of the Christian faith, William Dudley Pelley's silver shirts, the initials SS were intentional, and the veteran-based khaki shirts were only just a few of our openly fascist organizations. The idea that America is a defender of democracy, liberty, and human rights would come as a huge surprise to those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, who saw their democratically elected governments subverted and overthrown by the United States in Panama in 1941, Syria, 1949, Iran, 1953, Guatemala, 1954, the Congo, 1960, Brazil, 1964, Chile, 1973, Honduras, 2009, and Egypt in 2013. And this list does not include a host of other governments that, however despised, as was the case in South Vietnam, Indonesia, or Iraq, were viewed as inimical to American interests and destroyed, in each case inflicting death and immiseration on millions. Empire is the external expression of white supremacy. The millions of victims of racist imperial projects in countries such as Mexico, China, India, the Congo, and Vietnam, for this reason, are deaf to the fatuous claims by Jews that their victimhood is unique. And so are Black, brown, and Native Americans. They also suffered Holocausts, but these Holocausts remain minimized or unacknowledged by their Western perpetrators. Israel embodies the ethno-nationalist state the far right in the United States and Europe dreams of creating for themselves, one that rejects political and cultural pluralism, as well as legal, diplomatic, and ethical norms. Israel is admired by these proto-fascists, including Christian nationalists, because it turns its back on humanitarian law to use indiscriminate, lethal force to cleanse its society of those condemned as human contaminants. Israel is not an outlier, but expresses our darkest impulses, ones being turbocharged by the Trump administration. I covered the birth of Jewish fascism in Israel. I reported on the extremist Meir Kahane, who was barred from running from office and whose Kaf party was outlawed in 1994 and declared a terrorist organization by Israel and the United States. I attended political rallies held by Benjamin Netanyahu, who received lavish funding from AIPAC and right-wing Americans when he ran against Yitzhak Rabin, who was negotiating a peace settlement with the Palestinians. Netanyahu's supporters chanted death to Rabin. They burned an effigy of Rabin, dressed in a Nazi uniform. Netanyahu marched in front of a mock funeral for Rabin. Rabin was assassinated on November 4th, 1995, by a Jewish fanatic, and Rabin's widow, Leah, blamed Netanyahu and his supporters for her husband's murder. Netanyahu, who first became prime minister in 1996, has spent his political career nurturing Jewish extremists, including Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Sarar, Naftali Bennett, and others. His father, Ben Zion, who worked as an assistant to the Zionist pioneer Vladimir Jabotinsky, who Benito Mussolini referred to, and I quote, as a good fascist, was a leader in the Herut Party that called on the Jewish state to seize all the land of historic Palestine. And many of those who formed the Herut Party carried out terrorist attacks during the 1948 war that established the State of Israel. Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, Sidney Hook, and other Jewish intellectuals described the Herut Party in a statement published in the New York Times as a, quote, political party closely akin in its organization, methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to Nazi and fascist parties. There has always been a strain of Jewish fascism within the Zionist project, mirroring the strain of fascism in American society. Unfortunately for us, the Israelis and the Palestinians, these fascistic strains are ascendant. The left is no longer capable of overcoming the toxic ultranationalism that has evolved here. Zev Sternhell, a Holocaust survivor, and Israel's foremost authority on fascism, warned in 2018. The kind whose European strain almost wiped out a majority of the Jewish people. Sternhill added, "We see not just a growing Israeli fascism, but racism akin to Nazism in its early stages." The decision to obliterate Gaza has long been the dream of far-right Zionists, heirs of Kahana's movement. Jewish identity and Jewish nationalism are the Zionist versions of the Nazis' blood and soil. Jewish supremacy is sanctified by God, as is the slaughter of Palestinians, who Netanyahu compared to the biblical Amalekites massacred by the Israelites. Euro-American settlers in the American colonies used the same biblical passage to justify the genocide of Native Americans. Enemies, usually Muslims, slated for extinction, are subhuman who embody evil. Violence and the threat of violence are the only forms of communication those outside the magical circle of Jewish nationalism supposedly understand. And messianic redemption will take place once the Palestinians are expelled. Jewish extremists call for the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest shrine for Muslims, built allegedly on the ruins of the Jewish Second Temple, which was destroyed in 70 CE by the Roman army, to be demolished. The mosque is to be replaced by a third Jewish temple, a move that would set the Muslim world alight. The West Bank, which the Zealots call Judea and Samaria, will be formally annexed. Israel will be governed by the religious laws imposed by the ultra-Orthodox Shas and United Torah parties, turning Israel into a Jewish version of Iran. There are over 65 laws which discriminate directly or indirectly against Palestinian citizens of Israel and those living in the occupied territories. The campaign of indiscriminate killing of Palestinians in the West Bank, many by rogue Jewish militias who have been armed with 10,000 automatic weapons, along with house and school demolitions and the seizure of remaining Palestinian land, is exploding. Israel, at the same time, is turning on Jewish traitors within Israel and abroad. Those who refuse to embrace the demented vision of the ruling Jewish fascists and to denounce the genocide. The familiar enemies of fascism, journalists, human rights advocates, intellectuals, artists, feminists, liberals, the left, and pacifists are targeted. The judiciary, according to plans put forward by Netanyahu, will be neutered. Public debate will wither. Civil society and the rule of law will cease to exist, and those branded as disloyal will be deported. Israel could have exchanged the hostages held by Hamas for the thousands of Palestinian hostages, many held for decades in Israeli prisons. Which is why the Israeli hostages were seized. They could have done this on October 8th. And there is evidence that in the chaotic fighting that took place once Hamas militants entered Israel, the Israeli military decided to target not only Hamas fighters, but the Israeli captives with them, killing perhaps hundreds of their own soldiers and civilians. Israel and its Western allies, James Baldwin saw, is headed towards the terrible probability that the dominant nations, struggling to hold on to what they have stolen from their captors and unable to look into their mirror, will precipitate a chaos throughout the world, which, if it does not bring life on this planet to an end, will bring about a racial war such as the world has never seen. I know these killers. I met them in the dense canopies in the war in El Salvador and Nicaragua. It was there that I first heard the single high-pitched crack of the sniper bullet, distinct, ominous, a sound that spreads terror. Army units I traveled with, enraged by the lethal accuracy of rebel snipers, set up heavy 50 caliber machine guns and sprayed the foliage overhead until a body, a bloodied and mangled pulp, dropped to the ground. I saw them at work in Basra, in Iraq, and of course Gaza, where on a fall afternoon at the Netzarim Junction, an Israeli sniper shot dead a young man a few feet away from me. We carried his limp body up the road. I lived with them in Sarajevo during the war. They were only a few hundred yards away, perched in high-rises that looked down on the city. I witnessed their daily carnage. At dusk, I saw a Serb sniper fire around in the gloom at an old man and his wife bent over their tiny vegetable plot. The sniper missed. She ran haltingly for cover. He did not. The sniper fired again. I can see the light was fading. It was hard to see. Then the third time, the sniper killed him. This is one of those memories of war I see in my head over and over and over and do not like to talk about. I watched it from the back of the Holiday Inn, but by now I have seen it, or the shadows of it, hundreds of times. These killers targeted me too. They struck down colleagues and friends. I was in their sights traveling from northern Albania into Kosovo with 600 fighters from the Kosovo Liberation Army, each insurgent carrying an extra AK-47 to hand off to a comrade. 3 shots, that crisp crack, too familiar. The sniper must have been far away, or maybe the sniper was a bad shot, although the bullets came close. I scrambled for cover behind a rock. My 2 bodyguards bent over me, panting, the green pouches strapped to their chests, packed full of grenades. I know how these killers talk, the black humor. Pint-sized terrorists, they say, of Palestinian children. They are proud of their skills. It gives them cachet. They cradle their weapon as if it is an extension of their body. They admire its despicable beauty. This is who they are, their identities, killers. These killers are numb to the suffering they inflict. Maybe they enjoy it. Maybe they think they are protecting themselves, their identity, their comrades, their nation. Maybe they believe the killing is a necessary evil, a way to make sure Palestinians die before they can strike. Maybe they have surrendered their morality to the blind obedience of the military, subsumed themselves into the industrial machinery of death. Maybe they are scared to die. Maybe they want to prove to themselves and others that they are tough, they can kill. Maybe their mind is so warped that they believe killing is righteous. They, like all killers, are intoxicated by the godlike power to revoke another person's charter to live on this earth. They revel in the intimacy of it. They see in fine detail through the telescopic scope the nose and mouth of their victims, the triangle of death. They hold their breath, They pull slowly, gently on the trigger, and then the pink puff, severed spinal cord, it is over. They are numb and cold, but it does not last. I covered war for a long time. I know, even if they do not, the next chapter of their lives. I know what happens when they leave the embrace of the military, when they are no longer a cog in the factories of death, when the adrenaline rush of combat is gone. I know the hell they enter. It starts like this. All the skills they acquired as a killer on the outside are useless. Maybe they go back. Maybe they become a gun for hire. But this only delays the inevitable. They can run for a while, but they cannot run forever. There will be reckoning, and it is the reckoning I will tell you about. They will face a choice. Live the rest of their lives stunted, numb, cut off from themselves, cut off from those around them. Descend into a psychopathic fall, trapped in the absurd, interdependent lies that justify mass murder. There are killers years later who say they are proud of their work, who claim not a moment's regret. But I have not been inside their nightmares. If this is the route they take, they will never again truly live. Of course, they do not talk about what they did to those around them, certainly not to their families. They are feted as heroes, but they know, even if they do not say it, that this is a lie. The numbness usually wears off. They look in the mirror, and if they have any shred of conscience left, their reflection disturbs them. They repress the bitterness. They escape down the rabbit hole of opioids, or like my uncle who fought in the South Pacific in World War II, alcohol. Their intimate relationships because they cannot feel, because they bury their self-loathing, disintegrate. This escape works for a while, but then they go into such darkness that the stimulants used to blunt the pain begin to destroy them. And maybe that is how they die. I have known many who have died like that, and I have known those who ended it quickly, a gun to the head. I have trauma from war, but the worst trauma I do not have. The worst trauma from war is not what you saw. It is not what you experienced. The worst trauma is what you did. They have names for it: moral injury, perpetrator-induced traumatic stress. But this seems tepid given the hot burning coals of rage, the night terrors, the despair. Those around them know something is terribly, terribly wrong. They fear this darkness. But they do not let others into their labyrinth of pain. And then one day they reach out for love. Love is the opposite of war. War is about death. It is about smut. It is about turning other human beings into objects, maybe sexual objects. But I also mean this literally. For war turns people into corpses. Corpses are the end products of war, what comes off its assembly line. So they want love, but death is made a Faustian bargain. It is this. It is the hell of not being able to love. They carry this death inside them for the rest of their lives. It corrodes their souls. And yes, we have souls. They sold theirs. The cost is very, very high. It means that what they want, what they most desperately need in life, they cannot attain. They spend days wanting to cry and not knowing why. They are consumed by guilt. They believe that because of what they did, the life of a son or a daughter or someone they care about is in danger. Divine retribution. They tell themselves this is absurd, but they believe it anyway. They start to indulge in little offerings of goodness to others, as if these offerings will appease a vengeful God, as if these offerings will save someone near to them from harm, from death. But nothing wipes away the stain of murder. They are overwhelmed with sorrow, regret, shame, grief, despair, alienation. They face an existential crisis. They know that all the values they were taught to honor in school and worship at home are not the values they upheld. They hate themselves they do not say this out loud. Shooting unarmed people is not bravery. It is not courage. It is not even war. It is a crime. It is murder. And Israel runs an open-air shooting gallery in Gaza and the West Bank as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Total impunity, murder as sport. It is exhausting trying to ward off these demons. Maybe they will make it being human again. But that will mean a life of contrition. It will mean making the crimes public. It will mean begging for forgiveness. It will mean forgiving themselves, and this is very hard. It will mean orienting every aspect of their lives to nurturing life rather than extinguishing it. This is the only hope for salvation. If they do not take it, they are damned. It will mean rejecting the empty jingoism, the abstract words of glory, honor, and patriotism, used to mask the cries of the wounded, the senseless killing, war profiteering, and chest-pounding grief. It will mean rejecting the lies the perpetrators of war do not acknowledge, the lies covered up in stately war memorials and mythic war narratives, filled with stories of heroism and comradeship. It will mean rejecting the lies that permeate the thick, self-important memoirs by amoral statesmen and women who make wars but do not know war. For war is necrophilia. War is a state of almost pure sin, with its goals of hatred and destruction. War fosters alienation, leads inevitably to nihilism, and is a turning away from the sanctity and preservation of life. All other narratives about war too easily fall prey to the allure and seductiveness of violence, as well as the attraction of the power that comes with a license to kill with impunity. We must name and face our darkness. We must repent. Our willful blindness and historical amnesia, our refusal to be accountable to the rule of law, our belief that we have a right to use industrial violence to exert our will marks, I fear, the start, not the end, of campaigns of mass slaughter by the global north against the world's growing legions of the poor and the vulnerable. It is the curse of Cain, and it is a curse we must remove before the genocide in Gaza becomes not an anomaly, but the norm. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the first questions was to ask your thoughts about the control of U.S. foreign policy that Israel has, your assessment of the Israel lobby, the role of Christian Zionists, also with the misinformation the American public receives. How much of a role do you think media misinformation also plays in all of that?
So unfortunately, all of the major institutions, including the Democratic Party, I hope nobody in here voted for Kamala Harris. So, yeah. So unfortunately, all of the major institutions, including the Democratic Party, I hope nobody in here voted for Kamala Harris. So, yeah. Genocide is not a political issue, it's a moral issue. So all of these institutions, they created and perpetuated the lie that those opposing the genocide were Hamas supporters and anti-Semites. I spent a lot of time in the Princeton encampment and the encampment in Columbia, and of course, a significant percentage, maybe up to 30% of those courageous students who are our nation's conscience, were Jewish. That was done on Friday night, both at Columbia and Princeton. They would lay down a tarp, and the Muslim students would say their prayers, and then on the same tarp, the Jewish students would hold Shabbat. And that's the kind of world we want to create. But all of the media organizations never bothered to report. The universities themselves, and let's be clear, university administrators, universities have been corporatized. They don't work for their faculty, they don't work for their students. They work for private equity firm billionaires and hedge fund managers and arms, weapons manufacturers on their trustee boards, half of whom should be in prison. And they seized this moment to essentially eradicate the American left. That's what this is about. Of course, the left is about, I've taught at Princeton, Columbia, and NYU, graduated from Harvard. The left is about as welcome on these campuses as Trump. The idea that these are bastions of Marxist radicalism is absurd. But what's also absurd is that somehow these institutions condone or perpetuate anti-Semitism. But you saw all of them flagellate themselves to cater to the centers of power, giving credence to that lie, and essentially handing the bullets to their own executioners. So they are culpable. Harvard, which is fighting back, was one of the most egregious universities in terms of crushing dissent and free speech on its campus. And the Democratic Party, of course, has been completely culpable in perpetuating wishing were even worse. Well, and Pelosi, Okay, I'm a minister. I can't use words like Pelosi speaks. Yeah, okay, there we go. So they set it up. They created the atmosphere by which those people within our society have a conscience are expelled from camp. I mean, you can't even do flyering. You can't set up flyer tables at these universities, and that is that weaponization of anti-Semitism. I mean, the other irony is that most of the people around Trump are white Aryan anti-Semites, but right-wing anti-Semites get a pass because this is a goal to destroy the left. And unfortunately, the liberal class, which when the presidents of the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard went down before the congressional hearings, they were punished for not groveling enough. And unfortunately, the left could have saved them because the left is not afraid to call apartheid apartheid and genocide genocide. Not to mention the fact that we have an analysis of power that they don't. They thought that this was somehow a discussion of good faith and they could appease. I mean, look at Columbia. They did not understand what was and has happened. Ellen Schrecker, who was just on Amy's show, wrote two great books, No Ivory Tower and Such Were the Crimes, I think was the other book, and I read both of them, they're both very good, on McCarthyism. I think correctly points out that this is worse than McCarthyism because it's not about a witch hunt against individuals within institutions, it's about destroying the institutions themselves. And that's where we are. And I'll tell you, having just come back from interviewing dozens of Palestinians from Gaza who feel not only completely forgotten and sense that within the eyes of the rest of the world they are worthless, but it has engendered a very legitimate rage. And there will be blowback. It's inevitable. When you traumatize a people like this, they will react as any people who have endured trauma will react. And my fear is that some kind of a quote-unquote terrorist attack then ends up becoming a gift to the Trump administration. And for those of us who do stand up, it's, that morning is when the SUV with the tinted windows shows up at your house. I think that's where we're headed. We don't live in a fascist state yet. If we did, I would not be here speaking. You would not be here listening to me. But we are moving rapidly towards it. And these people, they have long planned this. Over a decade ago, I wrote a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right, or We're on America. And I denounce these people for what they are, which is heretics. They're not Christians. In the same way that Zionists are Jewish heretics. I read a lot of Jewish theology, Heschel and Buber and others. If you want to know what Judaism is really about, then go to a Jewish Voice for Peace rally. Just as Zionism has hijacked Judaism, Christian fascists have hijacked Christianity. So the project has long been in the pipeline. They know what they're doing. They know the kind of state that they want to create. They're quite upfront about it. I mean, that's the kind of irony about it. They're transparent about where they're going and what they're doing, but they have been aided and abetted by a bankrupt liberal class.
The book that Chris wrote following up American Fascists is The Death of a Liberal Class, which is a fantastic read as well. The second question in there, do you know what happened at UCLA here? In particular, all the crackdowns that occurred just a few miles from where we are, Chris?
I know that the police were brutal.
The police actually stood back
while Zionists
attacked directly.
If you look at when Jabotinsky and Kahana built the JDL on it, they modeled it on the brown shirts. I mean, I used to work out in the gym in Jerusalem with all these lunatics from Brooklyn. Yeah, they were just thugs. One of my great journalistic coups was tracking down in the Jewish settlement of Kiryat Arba the killer of Alex Odeh. His name was Robert Manning. And I was doing a story on what the colonists called protection of the highways, where they would stock Palestinian cars and haul people out and beat them and sometimes shoot them. So I was hanging out with these goons. And I went back to Kiryat Arba to interview them, and this huge guy walked in the room, American, and I interviewed him as well. He had a long-barreled weapon, a pistol, and a huge knife strapped to his leg. And then when I asked him his name, he said it was William Lack. William Lack was the FBI agent in charge of the Manning case, and he didn't know that I knew that. And I managed to get a copy of Manning's California driver's license and then go back. And this is one of those moments as a journalist where you don't want to get caught, because if you do, you're going to be lucky to get out. And I went to his neighbors and held up the picture and ID'd him. And Israel, which said they didn't know where he was, had to extradite him, and he's sitting in a California prison.
Given your background in theology and political resistance, do you believe humanity can still find moral common ground to overcome today's fragmentation, or must be passed through a land of collective unmaking, a spiritual or societal debt, before any real rebirth or unity becomes possible? That's from Claudia in Woodland Hills. John Brown was a moral incendiary before the U.S. Civil War. Yourself and others have been telling the truth about Palestine for decades that seem like prophets crying in the wilderness. How can we turn the moral conscience of our nation in our time of willful ignorance?
Well, I spent a lot of time, spent 20 years overseas, and many of the countries I covered were either in the midst of war or governed by authoritarian, despotic regimes. And to stand up against radical evil is to willfully accept your own self-destruction. That's what Oscar Romero did. That's what the two greatest prophets in the United States, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, did. They knew at the end that they would be killed. And I think really that is, I come out of the radical Christian left. My father was a Presbyterian minister. My mother was a seminary graduate. My dad had fought in World War II, became a pacifist. He was in North Africa. Became a pacifist after the war, was in the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the anti-war movement. for his outspokenness on behalf of the GBLT community. My uncle was gay. My father was very close to his brother. He was thrown out of the church. And I remember I did my undergraduate degree at Colgate University. My father had a church in Syracuse, which was an hour away. And he came down to get me because after he was barred from speaking publicly and remember, churches were very, very cruel to these people, being barred for speaking out publicly for equal rights and ordination and marriage. He instead organized Easter service for the GBLT community of the city of Syracuse. And he said, this is the last time you're going to hear me preach. And he was a great preacher. And I always remember going into that church, and there were two women sitting in the front pew, and they were holding hands so tightly, the hands were white. And my dad said, marriage is a sacrament. It is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that doesn't honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian. And years later, when I denounced the calls to invade Iraq and was lynched by right-wing media every hour for 4 days, the New York Times called me in and gave me a written reprimand, and you give the employee under guild or union rules the reprimand, and then if the employee continued, and the reprimand was that I was no longer allowed to speak about Iraq, and then because I had quote-unquote impugned the impartiality of the New York Times, we were raped. And it's 15 years at the Times. I'm not going to pretend it was an easy moment. It's not easy to lose your job. But I realized that my choice was that I could pay fealty to my career, but to do so would be to betray my father. And I couldn't do that. And I remember walking out and articulating, I think for the first time, what it was my father had given me, and that was freedom. I didn't need the New York Times to tell me who I was. I knew who I was. I was my father's son. And I often say it's my voice, but they're his words. And in the Christian church, we call that resurrection. And I think that is the power. Daniel Berrigan, the great radical high priest who baptized my daughter, he held my daughter in his arms and talked about marching in Selma with King. I asked him how he defined faith, and he said, the belief that the good draws to it the good, even empirically if everything around you says otherwise. And I think that's right. It's standing up for justice, standing up for what James Cone called the crucified of the earth, what they call bearing the cross. It means that when you truly stand with the crucified, when you truly stand with the oppressed, eventually you will be treated like the oppressed. And coming out of a faith tradition, it's why I have such affinity with Muslims, because in the Muslim world they still take religion seriously. It is that moral imperative justifies itself. It's not about what's practical. It's not about what we can achieve. It's about what is right. It is about making sure that the Palestinians or those in our carceral system, I've taught in the New Jersey prison system for the college degree program at Rutgers now for over 15 years. I've taught 600 students in the prison system. It's making sure that those people realize that not only are they not forgotten, but they will never be abandoned and never be betrayed, no matter the cost. Well, my plane's tomorrow, so we'll mess it up. All right, good piece. It's so nice not to be shouted down by Zionists. At a loss. Oh, we can get nasty, pretty nasty.
People did ask about what personal price you paid for speaking out of your activism, and along those lines, where best can everybody here not only follow your work, but help disseminate it?
Everything's on Substack. I've kind of been fired to one institution after another. Hoodie Truth Dig and The Real News and chrishedges.substack.com. So that's everything my wonderful producers here, Max. So we still do a weekly show. I tend to gravitate towards books as a writer. One of the things I've always found frustrating as a writer is that when I do interviews, they haven't read the book. So my effort goes into really reading the book. Probably 70% of my interviews are with authors. And then I write a column. I try and write at least 4 columns a month. That's going to get really tough now that I'm trying to get this book done with Sacco. But yeah, chrishedges.substack.com. And KPFK. It's a great radio sympathy.
Any particular advice about resistance around Palestine in the Trump era?
Yeah, I mean, this is a moment by which all of us will be judged because our country sustains the genocide. If we stopped weapon shipments today, the genocide would stop almost instantly. None of the 2 ruling parties are going to stop it. And I think it is incumbent upon us to take actions that halt the shipment of weapons to Israel. That means not loading ships that have supplies of weapons destined for Israel. It means, as the courageous protesters have done in the UK, trying to shut down weapons manufacturers that are producing the weapons, certainly protesting outside their gates. They've done this with Elbit Systems. That's our job because nobody else is going to do it. And even if we fail, we are sending a message to the rest of the world that there are some of us who have a conscience and moral courage.
I suppose this question was one I was sort of hesitant to ask because of the reality of the situation in Palestine, but someone did ask it, and it's, can you talk a little about what the future leadership of an unfinished Palestine could look like vis-a-vis the political parties? Do you think a new one will emerge if the Palestinians decide, but how can these decisions be considered under the crush of this Holocaust?
Well, if you watch closely what's happening in Gaza, this is really a war to destroy civil society. It's why they have gone out of their way to target journalists, doctors, destroyed every university. And let me be clear, and this came up in the interviews we just did in Egypt. The way these doctors or journalists are killed, it's not random. The doctor will be leaving the house for work and they're killed by a drone, or they will be killed by a drone moments after they come home. And the way they're targeted is that, let's say you have a 5-story apartment building, the drone will blow up only their apartment. That has happened to innumerable journalists and innumerable doctors. So the goal is to create lawless chaos. You've already seen it through the weaponization of starvation, very understandable rioting by desperate people seeking to get food, breaking into warehouses, and all of the structure of civil society, whether it's police or all of those functions that can maintain order, as well as, of course, the intellectual class and the artistic class, musicians, poets, Rifat al-Hariri, it's all being taken from them because the goal is to reduce the Palestinian people to essentially an ungovernable herd. That's the goal. Look, I know Hamas really well, and I knew Dr. Abdelaziz Rantisi, one of the co-founders of Hamas, quite well. After he was assassinated with his son in 2004, I knew his successor, Nizar Rayan, who was also assassinated in his house with all of his family. It's always the oppressor who defines the configurations of resistance. And Israel has refused to speak with anything but savage violence to the Palestinians, in the same way the Nazis only spoke to the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto with violence. It's the only language left. And I'm not necessarily, I mean, I used to argue with Grancy because I was covering the bus bombings in Jerusalem. I had to go to these, and I argued with Grantisi about it, that, children are children. I don't really care whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or whatever. And his argument became statistical. I don't buy it, but he said, he would give me the long lists of Palestinian children who have been killed, which, of course, far dwarfs the number of Israeli children who have been killed, and say when they stop killing our children, we'll stop killing their children. My argument to him was that you're surrendering the moral high ground you have as an oppressed people by engaging in the same activities that you're oppressing. Yeah. Look, whatever you say about Hamas, the fact that I'm saying this over dinner at his house, and who's a pediatrician, first in his class, University of Alexandria, not the stereotypical cartoon figure of Hamas that they feed you in the media. But the fact that he heard it, and that, I would say we had a relationship. In fact, I could work anywhere in Gaza, and he had sent out instructions, leave him alone. He's an honest journalist, don't touch him. I could walk through, as I did, Han Yunis refugee camp at 1 a.m, and nothing would happen to me. So yeah, it's Israel that created all resistance movements use terrorism. The ANC did, the Ergon, the Jewish resistance did before 1948. Because if you don't have a navy, you don't have artillery, you don't have mechanized units, you don't have an air force, then you are going to seize upon cruder forms of violence in order to fight back. And I think the great book that dissects this is C.L.R. James's masterpiece, Black Jacobins, where when the Haitians rose up, the only successful slave revolt in human history, and Haiti's been paying court ever since. There were atrocities carried out against the white slaveholding class. But as James points out, these were momentary eruptions, just as October 7th was, and you can't compare it to the state terrorism that exists week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And that's why Norman Finkelstein is correct when he likens what happened on October 7th to Nat Turner's saber hold.
We should be wrapping in about 10 minutes. But you did have a question about now that habeas corpus is under threat, just your reflections on your lawsuit against Obama, and maybe if you want to remind folks what that was about.
Yeah, I didn't vote for Obama. Dennis Kucinich gave me, he gave me a printout of Obama's voting record in the Senate. Said, you better read this. And Dennis, he's a big baseball fan. He said, when I go to the baseball game in Cleveland, I don't follow sports. What is it? Cleveland Braves or what is it? Yeah. He said people would walk up and down and say, get the scorecard, get this, that's the scorecard. He said, ignore everything else. And it was every corporate giveaway, supporting the death penalty. It was really dirty. I remember that was a very unpopular position to take, opposing it. I worked for Meter. I was Meter's speechwriter. But I remember trying to make the argument against Obama and being booed in Berkeley. I thought, well, we're in really big trouble.
No, he was the first Democratic senator to meet with the charter school people. Diane Ravitch was it? Yeah, when he was senator, yeah.
Well, he also totally caved to AIPAC. And, the big sin for me is he threw his Coster Jeremiah Wright under the bus. You don't do that, where I come from. Jerry's amazing. Great guy.
You had a question about the media coverage of Russia, Ukraine, and what you see in terms of media bias there.
Well, That's Chomsky's great delineation between what he called worthy and unworthy victims. So Ukrainians, probably no small part because they're white, are worthy victims and Palestinians are not. I opposed the arming of Ukraine. I covered the revolutions in 1989 in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. I was there when Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, and James Baker, the Secretary of State, promised. You remember, they could not unify Germany without the acquiescence of the Soviet Union. And they promised Gorbachev, I was in the room, or in the press conferences, they promised Gorbachev that they would not expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany.
That's right.
And they violated that promise, and Russia kept saying over and over, don't stop. Remember, Russia has a real historical trauma. It was invaded 3 times through the Ukraine, once by Napoleon in the First World War and the Second World War. WikiLeaks leaked a cable sent by William Burns, who was then the ambassador in Moscow, that said it doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum. In Russia, you do not make Ukraine a NATO country. So I don't defend what Putin did, but I also know that he was baited and provoked, and that Russia gave constant, and then we have to talk about the Maidan coup, which the CIA was pumping millions of dollars to fund. And the repression against ethnic Russians is real. It's real. So the whole thing should have never happened. So number one, I felt we were highly culpable for what happened. But secondly, having covered a lot of war, I understood that there was no way the Ukrainians were going to win a war of attrition, ever. It was a very cynical policy, like all proxy wars. That's what this is, and I covered a lot of proxy wars. The goal of those who fund their proxies is often very different. I spent a lot of time with the Kurds, who were constantly being betrayed. What was the goal? The goal was to degrade the Russian military and isolate Putin from Europe. And if Ukraine was destroyed as a country and tens of thousands of Ukrainians died, so what? That's what this is about. So I always oppose that. And I hate to quote Henry Kissinger is certainly one of the most odious human beings. But 4 months into the conflict, he said, this is crazy. Yeah, he later retracted it all, but he said we have to, there has to be an exchange of land for peace. That is what's going to happen, but it could have happened long before Ukraine was destroyed.
Final question now, folks, for Chris Hedges' sake. A little bit of a summary of some of the things I've seen, a little bit freelancing for myself. You write with great empathy for the American working class, for poor and oppressed Americans. We obviously live in an era in which wealth concentration is just the zeitgeist of the day. It's ever more concentrated. Public services are being underfunded. Do you believe that democracy in the United States can produce, and not democracy in this corroded manner that we had now, but that a democratic society in America is a desire of the American people, and that a more honest democracy would generate a more just society at this hour in our history? Or are we just sort of trapped inside a matrix of corporatized culture that has the brains of all of us in American society unbalanced to a house?
Well, I always stood with Ralph on this issue. I was not a great fan of woke preaching and virtue signaling to the working class. I don't have a problem, obviously, with inclusiveness and all of that stuff, but when it's divorced from class warfare, then it becomes a kind of boutique activism. There's only one way to wrest back our democracy, flawed, of course, and it's kept within the confines of capitalism, and that is through building labor organizations. Every other activity is a linear time. Really, the focal point of all union activity must be the unionization of Walmart and Amazon. If we want to save our apist society, that is where all our energy has to go. And as Ralph pointed out, if you're organizing Amazon or you're organizing Walmart, you are going to be working with people who voted for Trump. My mother's family comes from rural Maine. They are lower working class. My grandfather worked in a post office. My other uncle was a plumber. And I watched what NAFTA did to these rural Maine communities. There's no way around it. The working class in this country was betrayed. We should have walked out of the Democratic Party in 1894. And it stood in solidarity with the working class. That was our failure. Instead of voting for these cretins like Obama. Obama was the brand. He won Advertising Age's, I'm not making this up, Marketer of the Year. Yeah, he won it. Well, because Zappos, they knew what he'd done. He's a product of the Chicago political machine, which was one of the dirtiest in the country. So we have to rebuild those unions. I support third parties. I mean, I haven't voted for a Democrat, I think, since 2000. But which one? Anyone. I don't care. I mean, the Green Party, basically the Green Party, is dysfunctional as it is. But line from Linda Goldman, if voting was that effective, it'd be illegal. Our energy has to go into organize. Because it's only by building unions that we will begin to fight back against social inequality and the billionaire class. And as Ralph said, when you organize, let's say you're organizing against Amazon, and let's say you're a Trump supporter, you're going to find out very quickly not only where the real centers of power lie, which are corporate, but how vicious they are. And that in and of itself is an educational process. So Saul Alinsky, the great organizer in Chicago, said, there are no permanent allies, there's only permanent power. And that means making, if we, for instance, are trying to organize a Walmart, we can be very upfront about where we stand in terms of our positions and our support for migrants or GBLTQ people, whatever it is. We're going to have to work with people who have been indoctrinated. But I think that confrontation with power in and of itself is extremely revealing and has the capacity to educate people about where power is and what power thinks of them. You are always going to have every fascist society recruits, that's why Marx hated the lumpen proletariat, it recruits dispossessed, angry people to do their dirty work. If you look at the labor wars in this country, which were the bloodiest in the industrialized world, hundreds of American workers were murdered, tens of thousands were injured, blacklisted, and much of the violence that was carried out wasn't just simply by the police and National Guard, but by the Pinkertons, by gun thugs, by private militias. And if you look back on that labor struggle, capitalism doesn't change. And capitalists today will use the same lethal force, violence, and intimidation that they used in the past. But if we're going to dig ourselves out of this species of American fascism, it's going to come by building militant, radical labor movements that shut the machine down.